The scripture lesson this morning comes from the letter to the Corinthians, specifically the second letter, chapter 10, verses 1 through 11. Hear the words of the Apostle Paul. I, myself, Paul, appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I, who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away. I ask that when I am present, I don't need to show boldness by daring to oppose those who think we are acting according to human standards. Indeed, we live as human beings, but we do not wage war according to human standards. For the weapons of our warfare are not merely human, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every proud obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. We are ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Look at what is right before your eyes. If you are confident that you belong to Christ, then remind yourself of this, that just as you belong to Christ, so also do we. Now, even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for tearing you down, then I won't be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem as though I am trying to frighten you with my letters. For you say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and so his speech is contemptible. Let such people understand that what we say by letter when absent, we will also do when present. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. This morning's scripture lesson is a real doozy. For one thing, you'll notice we're not reading a gospel story. The gospel stories that we typically encounter on Sunday mornings are easier to preach in some ways because they're stories. They have a narrative. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a little easier too, although sometimes a little oversimplified, for me to kind of sum up what I think the meaning of the story is, or what I hope that you can take away with you this morning with a story. It's a little easier. But a letter like this has context. We're dropping in the middle of a conversation that we're not really a part of, that in some ways has a lot to say to us this morning, but in other ways is a conversation that ended 2,000 years ago when Paul died. This is an administrative passage. It's one of the things that I love about the New Testament is that as far as holy books go, as far as holy texts go, very rarely, if you look at all of the holy texts that exist among all the religious traditions of the world, it's less common to find administrative pieces like this one. It's less common to see pieces of text that reflect how the religion was actually being run as a religion in its founding moments. We rarely get such a behind-the-scenes look. And so Paul is essentially giving us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain at a fight that he's been having with the Corinthian church for some time. Now, it is no secret to us, I think, anyone who's encountered St. Paul's words before, that Paul can come off a bit too strong. There are entire fields of Christian study at the academic level dedicated to trying to figure out which version of Christianity belongs to Jesus and which version of Christianity belongs to Paul. That's how controversial the Apostle Paul's words are. Sometimes folks who are familiar with the words of the Apostle Paul will say things like, well, I really like that Jesus guy. I'm just not sure how I feel about Paul. Paul often bears the weight or takes credit for things in the early church like the continuation of the practice of slavery, or the inequality of women in the church. Paul takes time out of his very, very busy life running the church to clarify that at least in some cases, slavery as an institution will still continue in the Christian church, and at other times, women will be asked to be silent in the public assembly. So Paul, needless to say, in the modern age, has a bit of a bad rap. But it's curious to note that this reputation extends 2,000 years ago as well, and that the early church quite didn't know what to do with him either. He came across as abrasive at times. He came across as too firm, maybe too judgmental. But then there's this bit in Paul's letter about how his demeanor comes off in person, how he seems a little different. He's a little gentler, he's a little humbler, he's a little more shy. Whatever tone Paul felt he was trying to strike in his letters, and whatever tone the early church thought Paul struck in his letters, there's the belief that perhaps Paul doesn't always make friends. There's the belief that Paul doesn't always come across as the nicest guy, and therefore has to defend himself a little bit, particularly since in person, at the very least, he seems a little more shy, a little less likely to give orders, a little less likely to boss people around, as the case may be. And so Paul, in an act of administration, reminds the church that he, as one of the leaders of the church, has some authority over them, but also takes them to task for judging him on the basis of how he communicates. There's a kind of don't shoot the messenger point that Paul is trying to make about his speech this morning. That Paul feels it's important that he has something genuinely from God to share, but that the people are going to miss it because Paul himself isn't always the most agreeable person. I'm sure none of us can relate to that this morning. That feeling of really wanting to get a point across or communicate a message effectively or build a bridge or whatever the case may be, and feel like you stuck your own foot in your mouth, right? You said something that you didn't mean to say or that came off as too harsh, and then you have to go back and spend some time and energy clarifying what it was you meant to say in the first place. So you start to second guess yourself. Maybe after a while, you become so paranoid that you're going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing that you clam up completely. And you learn helplessness. I don't want to say cowardice, because I feel like it comes from a place of good judgment in many cases. We realize that sometimes we say the wrong thing, so we want to overcorrect. So I won't say that that's cowardice, but it's maybe going a little too far in the opposite direction. We can get to the point where we're so afraid we're going to say the wrong thing that we don't say anything at all. Or we're so afraid to try something because we're afraid we're going to mess it up that we don't try it at all. And so, in this administrative passage, in addition to seeing behind the curtain of the early church a little bit, we're also learning a very valuable lesson from St. Paul about how differently you and I as individuals might communicate. I've talked about, with stewardship and other things, how diversity of opinion and perspective is important to the church. I'm not going to revisit that this morning, but I feel like there is some gem of connectivity there. That how you choose to communicate may be very different from how I choose to communicate, but both are valid. There are ministers that I know personally and ministers that I've simply observed that I absolutely can't stand. And here's why. They're incredibly articulate. They're so smart. They do it so easily when they stand up to speak or to present. It seems to come so naturally to them. There are videos that I watch during the week to help me prepare, to help me think about how I want to present the message every week. And I watch these videos and I'm like, what a jerk. You're so good at that. There are ministers in this association that I cast side-eye at, I have to admit, because they're just so good at what they do. And so I start to think, what's the point of my own voice when I see folks around me who are clearly so much better at getting the point across that I want to get across? I'm sure you can't relate to that this morning in your own fields, right? Right? It's this funny thing. our own self-esteem can get in the way and can inhibit us, or our own lack of self-esteem can inhibit us from really sharing what we have within. And so St. Paul says this morning, I choose to speak up in the way that I know is best for me. In particular, I'm better writing than I am speaking. I think that's true for me as well. I tend to be much better when I'm sitting behind a keyboard than I do one-on-one. I sit down and I often think, oh, I really wanted to say that this morning. I should have said that instead. There's always something that I wish I had mentioned or hadn't forgotten. And no matter how many notes I make or how self-critical I get, there's always going to be something that I feel like I could have done better. I'm sure, even if you don't feel that way all the time, there's something that you can compare that to. And yet St. Paul says, it's incumbent upon me to speak up. And it's incumbent upon you to learn to listen in a new way. Perhaps I don't communicate in the way that's most effective for you. This is St. Paul speaking, and there's value in that. I mean, after all, Paul did not get along with the early leaders of the church. Paul and Peter fought constantly. It's not something we talk about a lot, but the reality was there were kind of two Christian churches in the early days. The Jewish followers of Jesus, led by Peter, and the followers of Paul, who tended to be more made up of the Gentile community, the non-Jewish community. And their take on Christianity was very different. It's not as if Paul represented the only status quo, and yet it was important for him to speak. And it was important for the Corinthian church to learn how to listen in a way that perhaps they weren't equipped for. Perhaps they expected a kind of strength that they received from Paul in letters that they didn't get in person. Or maybe they didn't like his strength. Perhaps they resented his strength. They didn't like being told what to do. Whatever the case may be, both parties in this equation had to learn something. Paul, as he even says, if I boast about my authority, it's just because I care about you so much. I want to do my best by you. I feel like I've been given you as a charge, and I want to make sure that I'm doing my utmost responsibility. I want to give you the best that I can. And for the Corinthian church to remember, we're under this guy. There's something to be learned here. There's something of value. And by under, I'm not talking about authority this morning in that way. I'm just talking about listening. It's very sad news. We've been dealing with so many different things. I feel like it's hard to keep track. When we do prayer requests, we say that every week. The latest news this week was that Anthony Bourdain, the famous chef and the television personality, took his own life. One of the stories, probably my favorite story about Anthony Bourdain that I've heard in the last couple of days, had to do with a book of criticism that he allowed to be published. He actually paid for the publishing of a book of criticism by a small town critic, a woman who was not a professional food critic, who had been writing about different kinds of cuisine. Her voice had gone unheard. She wasn't a serious critic, and yet Bourdain thought it was really important that her voice be heard, and so he paid to have her book of cuisine writing, food writing, be published so that her voice could be heard. Despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that she wasn't a traditional critic, she didn't bring the same perspectives that status quo food critics would bring. She wasn't the kind of person you would expect to be called upon as an expert, and yet he publishes her. And why does he publish her? Because it's so important that unheard voices go heard, that voices are lifted up, that new perspectives are shared. It's important to speak up. And when others are speaking up, it's important for us to listen. In the days following Bourdain's death, there have been many ways of processing who he was as a person. Anytime we lose someone who means something to us, either as a cultural figure or a personal figure, we have to take some time to process what they mean. And the thing that Bourdain has meant for so many was his willingness to elevate conversations that were happening in food that people weren't aware of, just to gain an appreciation. My challenge for you as the church is that you too have a voice that needs to be heard. Whether in singing, whether in public speaking, whether in writing, whether in the work that you do, whether you speak by mouth verbally or you speak by your actions, whatever you do, it's important that you speak up. It's important as a person of faith that your experiences be heard. Even if, like the Apostle Paul, you don't consider yourself to be a particularly assertive public speaker, it's not just about public speaking. It's about being a representative for a different way of life. It's about saying that we don't all have to blindly follow a status quo if it's harmful and resisting it in some way. And perhaps there are status quos in your life that you're aware of that no one else is, and you are perfectly positioned to resist them. This morning, to transition into the next part of our service, I want to end, I haven't done this before, and I'm hoping everything works well this morning. We're going to try something a little different. There's a video that I want to show you, but I want to provide you a little bit of context. It's just a couple of minutes. This is a music video that was put together with a song by a guy named Michael Gungor, Michael and his wife, Lisa Gungor. They were, for a long time, worship artists here in Grand Rapids. Michael and his wife, Lisa, actually founded a church, an evangelical church in Grand Rapids many, many years ago. They have since left Michigan, and they've journeyed many, many places and had, over the last couple of years, a public falling out with the evangelical subcommunity of Christianity. And they were publicly criticized by a lot of the folks who had once praised and loved them because they spoke out against injustices that they saw in the Christian community, like homophobia in the church, like racism in the church, like how we sometimes interrogate or shame people for their beliefs or doubts. So many injustices within the church. And the Gungors were basically cast out of the status quo of evangelical Christianity for this. And in response, they wrote a song about our voices. And that song is something I want to share with you this morning. Now, the context of the video is specifically, and I think very fitting, since we've been talking a lot about in our national conversation, it's a conversation about racism. The video itself deals with police violence and racism, but it's only one of the aspects that the song itself covers. So this morning, as you're listening and reflecting, my invitation to you is think about your own status quos. Think about where your voice best needs to be heard. Reflect on that, whatever your voice looks like, whether it's actually your voice or simply your presence. Think about that this morning, reflect on that this morning, and be encouraged as we prepare to be God's people of love and mercy in the world.